I'm joined once again by Professor Salim Mansur of Western University, and today we're going to be talking about trust and what builds a society, how we lose trust in some of the institutions that we have trusted for generations, including our elections, education, teachers, university professors, present company excluded, Salim. Our government, our politicians, mind you, there was very little trust there to begin with. Doctors. I just saw a tweet by Maxime Bernier, and this is Saturday, November 27th, so if you want to look that up. An article in saltwire.com where a woman in Nova Scotia was denied access to her personal doctor because she was not vaccinated. So can we trust our doctors anymore? Can we trust our healthcare professionals? Can we trust our employers to do the right thing if they're going to deny a job to somebody because of their medical history? Are we going to continue to trust the financial system when the dollar today is going to be in the toilet tomorrow and your purchasing power is going to be destroyed because we can no longer trust our money? We can no longer trust even our neighbors in this world of vaxism, which is the new racism. You're vaccinated, you're not vaccinated, you're going to be casting aspersions on the moral character of somebody who may be vaccinated or may not be vaccinated. It goes both ways, this vaxism. So our neighbors, you're going to treat them a little more cautiously with what you might say to them about this issue. Can we trust the law anymore? Can we trust the police to uphold the law? Or are we going to live in fear of anybody in a uniform, including the military now, for example, in Australia, which is being deployed to take people who are unvaccinated and positive into a quarantine camp, a concentration camp, if you will. So, Salim, what is the basis of a society if it's not trust? And with the erosion of trust, which I'm going to take as given, today, can we basically see the destruction of society?
Yeah, very well put, Robert. First of all, thank you for having this conversation and we getting back again together. Very important question, Robert. It is ultimately not a political question. It is a philosophical question, a cultural question, but it all springs from the basic problem we are faced in society today, that is politics. Recently, I was in Washington, D.C. for a few days. I went down to a conference where I was invited, and I wanted to travel so that I could see for myself on the ground what is the situation. We have been sort of locked in since early 2020, so it's over or almost close to 2 years now, where we have not been able to travel and go freely around. So I took that opportunity and I drove down to Washington instead of flying because of all the uncertainties involved in flying, given the number of cancellations, flight being postponed or set off, canceled. Again, surrounding the issue of vaccine mandate with the pilot association and so on and so forth. So I drove down. And I spent a few days in Washington, and then I spent a few days after the conference with friends. One thing which I want to share with you on the question that you have raised is what struck me was this conference was the annual conference of the Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa. And people came from not only United States, from within United States, but from outside United States. There were a lot of Europeans and people from the Middle East, professors and journalists, Turks, Arabs, Israelis. And so it was a mixed crowd of people in the conference. But what struck me after spending several days there was how little people spoke about the current situation politically, not only in America, but the consequences of what is happening in America beyond America. People avoided the question, carefully. People didn't want to talk about it. People didn't want to talk about the political situation in America under the new administration, what had happened over the past year. And they didn't want to talk about things surrounding COVID. And I noticed that in the sense that whenever anyone around having a coffee or a meal with a number of people mention any of this thing, people deliberately walked away from engaging on these issues. And yet the meeting, the conference, the topic of the conference was political and cultural politics in the Middle East, and the biggest issue coming out of the Middle East over the last 6 months has been the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban once again. The keynote speech that was given by a former ambassador of Pakistan who was invited to give the keynote speech talked about the return of the Taliban and what it meant, and the all-round failure of the United States in Afghanistan over the past 20 years. He phrased it interestingly as it was not a 20-year plan for Afghanistan that failed, but 20 plans, each for 1 year, that failed. And later, after the keynote address, when people got together again, there was a deliberate effort not to dig too deep into the Biden administration and the problems of the Biden administration that was reflected in the return of the Taliban. So I came away, without getting too much into this, I came away recognizing that people don't want to talk about the big issues, the key issues, or the important issues, is because they don't know who is listening, what might be the consequences, who might tap you on the shoulder, and so on and so forth. And suddenly, it was like, we're sitting in former Soviet Union. Those of us who have studied former Soviet Union or read about former Soviet Union, read Solzhenitsyn and Gulag Archipelago and so on and so forth, that the people mingle, but the people did not engage. And the reason people did not engage was people did not trust not only the other, but themselves. They did not know. They did not feel comfortable. And so I walked away and I come back reflecting on this matter. And this is the United States, the capital of the free world, or at least it was the capital of the free world until very recently. And here in the capital of the free world, people are reluctant to speak.
We've come from a nation of trusting to a nation of suspicion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so we can see, we have been watching this, we have been running through the situation about people being deplatformed, cancel culture, the violence that we have watched on the news and on television over the past 20 months, particularly in the summer of 2020 in the United States. And all of that cumulatively has been very costly. And the ultimate cost is, I would say, the erosion of trust among people. It is not simply with strangers, it is with former friends, as you said, with neighbors. It is within families. People have become more guarded about what they say, what they think, how they deal with each other. And what does that mean? I think that's a huge question. But what it means at the simplest term is that any relationship is ultimately built upon trust. A family is built upon a trust. A relationship between a man and a woman, that is the nucleus of a family, is built upon trust. And on that trust is built a civilization, a culture, all the various institutions, and how we engage with each other at all levels in our life, with teachers, with doctors, with lawyers, with professors, and so on and so forth. And if that begins to fall apart, if that erodes, then ultimately, where are we headed? And I fear we are headed into becoming a society of atomized individuals. And as atomized individuals, we can then be manipulated, whichever way the powers want to manipulate us and take us, because we don't know where we are headed. We don't trust each other. We don't know what the information that we are receiving is factual, is based on evidence, or it is constructed and fabricated. And all of that leads to this atomization where we exist, but we no longer exist as a people related to each other, sharing common values, and upon which then we engage with each other. I think that's where we are headed, or if we have not already arrived. And it means a very bleak future. It means all that we took for certain, at least until recently, say the Christmas of 2019, is now more or less in the past, and the future is very foggy. And all of the big issues we might have to rethink in a way that we are at a loss, because we have to rethink by ourselves without being able to, engage with each other in that rethinking that is required of what sort of society we are building for our children. What is the legacy we are going to leave behind? And that leads to, in my mind, ultimately, that is not simply, as I said, a political question, it is a philosophical question. It is ultimately an existential and religious question, who are we? Where do we come from? And what is it in the higher sense that makes us ultimately moral and ethical human beings? And if we are not moral and ethical human being, then we are simply, again, instinctively living in terms of how best we can profit for ourselves at the expense of others. It's a society of expediency.
When I talked to you earlier, a few days ago, about this topic, I was thinking about trust and what it really means. And I came up with the idea that to trust someone is to be able to predict successfully how they will react to me and to certain situations. For example, if I'm walking down the street, I trust that the people I'm meeting are not going to kill me, jump me, rob me. If I was a woman at night, maybe that'll be a little different. But as a man walking on a street in Canada, I at least used to trust people to behave themselves. I trust the traffic in the other lane not to verge onto my lane, although it happens sometimes by accident. I trust when I go into a store and I pay with my money that they are going to accept it, that it's not counterfeit, that the change that I get back will be correct. I can predict that when I engage with people, I predict that they will act honorably and morally and honestly. And when you take away trust, you live in fear. You're always living with suspicion and fear and distrust. And you wonder whether or not you can ever get back to some sort of sense of happiness, because that's also the consequence of no trust and unpredictability, is that you lose your happiness. You lose your sense of value in a society because the society is broken. Now, I want to go to one area of trust particularly, and that is the mainstream media, what I now call the welfare press, because they are getting government handouts in order to be able to survive. I grew up in the 60s and 70s in Canada, more precisely in Newfoundland. We had two channels, CBC and CTV. We all watched Knowlton Nash at 11 o'clock. We all watched Floyd Robertson, right? We basically trusted them to give us the news, unvarnished truth, and honest opinion based on a moral, trustworthy society. That's gone. That's out the window. Now, that particular industry, the media, the only industry, by the way, that I can say in their advertisement emphasizes trust. Your trusted news source, the people you can trust to give you the news. They use it in their headlines, they use it in their banners and their bylines all the time, and in their marketing. I don't know of many other industries that say that. And yet they are the single industry that has eroded their trust completely. Nobody can trust the welfare press anymore. The big networks in the United States, we know not to trust them. Ironically, in a sense, Salim, this goes to predictability too, because now I can predict that if the mainstream media says one thing, it means the other. I can quite accurately predict that when they say that the next year's wheat harvest is going to be great, just like in the old Soviet Union and Pravda, truth, that it means that it's not going to be great. Your comments about the mainstream media, because to me, they are the focus. They are the filter through which everything that we know is being filtered and selected. And now we can't trust them. And those particular people in that industry are the ones destroying trust. Your thoughts?
Yes, I mean, the media was the window through which we looked at the world. We got our information, and then when we looked out and got our information, we did with that information, that is, we adjusted that information, we took that information and we compared it with other sets of information and so on and so forth. And, we came to a certain conclusion. And we could do that because the media, while it is in a sense plural, the media was diverse. The media had many windows, and you could choose your window on the basis of what was the information, what was the view that you were getting, that you felt that you could trust. And as you say, trust means to be able to predict, and over time, that's what you learned. You learned that, certain set of information, once you took that information in, you can then make a prediction about, the world with which you're interacting, and you could, accordingly conduct yourself. But that is gone to a large extent because we don't have that many more windows. We have one big tech window. And that one big tech window basically controls the entire information flow between you, and the world that we are trying to understand, relate to, derive our information, and therefore conduct ourselves accordingly. We just have that one window. And when we lose that sense that we can trust that window and the information that we're getting, because that window tells us, that media tells us that if you're not going to take this information, and if you're going to question this information, and if you're going to say something about this information that we, the media, do not and would not permit you to say, then we're going to cancel you. We're going to deplatform you. We're going to close your window. Then what happens is, I have this image in my mind. It is the legend of the 6 blind men trying to figure out what is this creature in their room, the elephant, and nobody can figure out what it is, So we are left to ourselves, and we are left to ourselves to understand the world without the help of anything, without the instrument that can tell us, And each one of us are in that sense deficient. We are not, in that sense, fully capable by ourselves individually to grasp the whole of reality. That's what the relationships are, I look up to you for certain information, and I look up to someone else for certain information or understanding, and I put it all together. And out of it, over a period of time, that trust is built up in which the information that you provide me, I can rely upon, and I can predict upon the world, predict the world in which I'm living and with which I'm interacting. And I think that's what we have arrived at. That was the window in the case of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, the Izvestia or the Pravda or the TASS. It is just that one window controlled by the party, and the party controlled by the Central Committee, and the Central Committee controlled by the General Secretary. And that was that one window. And if you did not accept the information of the window, or you began to lose trust in the information that came through the window, then you were culpable for being the wrong person. That you could then be not only deplatformed, but ultimately, you could be extinguished as a traitor, as whatever the party wanted to call you. Well, we read about that. We were given information about that. People who traveled to that part of the world came back with that set of information, and we saw it as a bizarre world. And suddenly that world is all around us. We are in that world. Yes. And we are trying to figure out, how do we go forward? We know from our understanding that the world that was the former Soviet Union, or any totalitarian society in that sense, which has one window and a control window with which or through which the people look at the world, understand the world, conduct themselves accordingly, eventually collapses. And it collapses ultimately because the people no longer trust each other, and it becomes extremely difficult to operate in that world till a point comes in time when the world itself, that world itself, breaks down. It can no longer operate on the basis of what is fundamental. That is, in a world 2 + 2 = 4, not as George Orwell's famous example in the book 1984 is that 2 + 2 is 5, and despite all your understanding, you have to accept 2 + 2 is 5, and you accept it going forward under compulsion, under coercion. It is not on the basis of trust, reason, and understanding. It is purely on the basis of coercion. And that coercion ultimately itself collapses. It cannot work. It cannot operate. I don't know at what point the world that we are entering, and have entered to some extent, can be sustained over a period of time. Particularly in the case of the United States, as the great experiment in terms of the meaning of individual freedom, a constitutional republic in which ultimately all state, all power ultimately is coercive, in the sense that if it is not, there is no control, then things fall apart. There has to be some way of controlling and maintaining a system in place. But the great experiment in the case of America, possibly the most unique experiment, in history, is that control, that coercion is built upon the consent of the people. Ultimately, it is the people. And they lay the limits within which that state can operate.
Yeah. You bring up a point, Salim, that I've been considering as well, and that is that while I totally agree with you, you need control. It has to be based on a set of objective laws, testable, provable over time, to be effective in maintaining peace, order, good government. Though I never really liked that peace, order, and good government thing. Maintaining order, peace. And what we're seeing now is a capriciousness in the law and our politicians, the lawmakers. It's no longer objective law. It's whatever a chief medical officer of health makes up. It's whatever a sock puppet like Trudeau feels and on a whim about what he's going to do tomorrow to keep in power. It is no longer about seeing a problem, having an open discussion on it, getting together with all the interested parties to debate it in Parliament, propose a law, have it go through first, second, third reading, royal assent, go to the Senate, and then talked about, and then put out on the media. Again, here's that filter where all of this discussion and debate takes place, puts out to the public by the media, who start to understand the issue and then either accept or reject the law, which should be objective. Today, what do we have? We have decrees by the PMO, decrees by Justin Trudeau himself, decrees by medical officers of health. This is the law. Decrees by, for example, in the United States, Biden puts out a press release about mandatory vaccination passports, and everybody goes with it because the press made the implication that this was now the law. It wasn't even a presidential order. It didn't even go through Congress. It was just a press release. There is no law. And yet we trust the media, or at least still a majority of us probably do. And so we go with this nonsense, this non-law. So yes, I agree with you. You need objective law, and we no longer have objective law. And that goes in with trust as well. We can no longer trust our politicians and the media to consider objective law in this country.
Yes, but at the heart of the question of objective law is the issue of freedom, individual freedom. And that's what I was saying, the consent of the people. I mean, any relationship that emerges in an institution and the ultimate institution being the state is resting upon the consent of the people. And it derives its legitimacy, its lawfulness, its authority from the consent of free people. But if that is broken, if that is snapped, if the consent of the people is no longer required in operating the state, then what is the state's basis of legitimacy except raw power? And the people then are removed. People have become atomized. People, you and I, no longer trust each other because, we as atomized individuals are living in a state of fear. We're powerless against this overwhelming coercive power of the state. So yes, objective law, but in this situation, the objective law is whatever the state says is the objective law. Back to Orwell, 2 + 2 is 5, and this is where we have arrived, whether it is the question of vaccine mandate, whether it is the question of, our constitution that can be manipulated and in fact, destroyed effectively. That's what has happened in the it's happening in the United States, it's happening in Canada. I mean, look, we 2 months ago, we had an election in Canada, and in that election, the hard issues were not discussed. One party was excluded from any of the conversation at the national level. I'm talking about Maxime Bernier and the PPC, even though we saw at the end of the election that the PPC had garnered something like 3 times the vote that it garnered in 2019 election, and has become, in effect, the 4th largest party in this country. We saw that we had a prime minister going into the election with 3 or 4 ethical violation, and nobody talked about it, nobody questioned it. We saw, and yet the media did not discuss it. We are back again to that one media. There is not many voices or many windows in which there can be a range of opinion, which would mean a range of opinion, meaning a range of ideas freely circulating, where free people can then make an assessment based upon the diversity of information that is available, but it was controlled. So we saw the manner in which our economy has been blown apart. In 2019, our federal budget deficit was somewhere in the order of $30 billion, going into 2 years later into the 2021 election in September. The budget had grown to almost $500 billion deficit, 354, $400 billion deficit, and so on and so forth. And here we are in a situation where the parliament operates without in any way even trying to maintain a sense of its accountability and responsibility to the people that have elected the parliament. We have all the four parties in the parliament basically singing from the same page. There's no opposition to question the prime minister, to question the governing party on its policies and on its behavior. Same thing in the United States. We are seeing, that what the political parties and the people running for the Congress say before and during the election, and then how they conduct themselves after the election, is purely, disconnected. There is no connection. There is no way of challenging them or bringing them into accountability, because again, the media only selectively tells the story and censors anything that goes against the narrative of the ruling powers. We have now seen, in effect, that there is a Republican democracy with all its institutions, but the most effective power, as opposed to the institutional and dignified power, is the power of the deep state that can operate without any accountability. And again, we have seen that over the last 3-4 years. And the big tech will not allow any discussion on those matters, that are germane to the idea of maintaining a free society that is a society of individuals who treasure the freedom and the institution respect and abides by the principle of individual freedom, which again, as I said in my opening, takes us back fundamentally to a more deeper question, that is a philosophical and ultimately religious question. Because here it is. I mean, where does my individual freedom to decide for myself based upon the best information that I can get for myself on any issue, whether it is what will be the weather be this afternoon and tomorrow and a week from today, to what will be the situation with the value of my money in my pocket, given the inflationary pressures that we are going through, and so on and so forth, my personal security, what I eat, how I maintain my health, who I listen to for medical advice or legal advice, So all of this comes down to the question that I exercise my freedom based upon the best information I can get, and then work it through those information to reach the best judgment I can about me and my place in this world. Where does this freedom come from? Is it something given to me by the government, by the state, or is it, as the American Constitution or the Declaration of Independence says, it is endowed by the Creator, that this is the gift of my Creator, not of my government, not of my state. In fact, it pre-exists the government, the state into which I am born. And therefore, it is not for the government and the state to in any way abridge, censor, or deprive me of what is the very fundamental fact of my being alive, that is my freedom, and to
There's one.
choose for myself.
There's
You see?
one.
So that's a religious question.
Well, yes. Well, maybe, because I don't believe in God, so I don't think my rights come from God. I think they're a logical consequence of me being a human being. But I don't want to get into that debate.
But that's a strange loop. I mean, let's talk about that.
I just wanted to set my position straight for the record.
Okay,
and say that this is not a religious discussion. This is
no,
a
it is
discussion
not,
about politics and rights. And there's one amendment to the United States, and you can probably correct me on this because I don't know the number. One amendment to the United States Bill of Rights, which says that this Bill of Rights is not to the enumeration of these rights is not to preclude the fact that there are other rights held by the people and the states. In other words, that was proof positive that that signers of the Declaration, not the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, knew that rights weren't man-made, right? Whether they come from God, nature, or your reason, they are many and varied, and just because we are enumerating them and protecting these particular rights doesn't mean that you don't have more of them. Unlike in the Canadian Constitution, which actually sets out, you've got these rights, and we're telling you you have these rights, and we may or may not protect them based on Section 1. So there's the objective law that I was talking about before, is that they have these laws and they can rationally justify exactly why they exist. You can't do that anymore.
Well, my understanding is then anything that is not clearly spelled out in the Constitution belongs to the people.
Yes, yeah. Or the states, sometimes in the states, they say the states.
Yeah, I mean, well, the states, and then the states can go back to the people, you know.
Sure.
So, I mean, the American Republic now constitutes of 50 states and so on. And the federal government has only the power to legislate upon exactly enumerated jurisdictions or aspects, and anything that is not enumerated in the Constitution belongs to the state. That's the 10th Amendment, and then that goes back to the people. But excuse me. But what I was saying about the strange loop, and I mean, it's not in that sense a religious question that you are a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or a Hindu or a Zoroastrian. I mean, Jefferson, if I recall, in the context of, again, the Bill of Rights debate and the very first amendment, about freedom of religion, freedom of worship, and freedom of speech, that is in the First Amendment, and no other constitutional society has a similar right. Canadian Constitution doesn't have that right. I mean, we don't have anything close to First Amendment in our BNA Act or Charter of Rights and Freedom. So in the context of that debate and discussion, Jefferson said something remarkable. He said, divided we stand and united we fall. This was about having an established religion in the United States. In the United States, there is no established religion. Church and states are separate. That's the disestablishment of religion in that sense. In the British Constitution or in the British system, there is the established religion. That's the Anglican Church, the Church of England, of which the monarch is the head. So in the American Constitution, there is no established religion in that sense, and that means there's freedom of religion, freedom of worship. The individual has the right to freely worship, freely believe in what he or she, the family, together, alone, whatever, in group, they worship. That was the Pilgrim Fathers arriving, fleeing from a continent that was in a tumult over religious conflict, between Catholics and Protestants and so on and so forth. So that's an amazing statement. Divided we stand. That means, there's no one religion that united, and the saying is the united we stand and divided we fall. In the case of Jefferson, he turned it around. He said, divided we stand. And so long we remain divided in terms of religion, free and equal, and people are free to follow and practice their faith in the manner in which they wish to follow, we stand. The moment we bring it together, so say that there is one religion, and if you do not follow that religion, then you will be excluded or punished or coerced, which is what Albert Camus said. When religion becomes politics, then religion is nothing but the Inquisition. And this is what we have seen in history with all formal state religion, whether it is Christianity, Catholicism, Islam, and so on and so forth. It becomes an Inquisition. But what I'm saying the strange loop, that my freedom is not something that was given to me by the state, by the will of the government, by the prime minister, or by some monarch, Elizabeth II.
It can only be taken away by these entities.
And if it is given to me, it can be taken away, precisely. Right. So the point is that my freedom, ultimately, that's what we are talking about. If we dispense with all of the other, wrinkles of the discussion that we are having, it goes back to the position or relation of the individual with the state, the individual with other individuals. Whatever is your perspective in that larger and deeper sense about who you are, and in terms about, again, for lack of a better word, religious question, where do you come from, and who are you related to, and so on and so forth. You and I might differ on this matter, but the point is that that is your freedom, and I have to respect that freedom just as you are, in some sense, obliged to respect my freedom. And it is in that context, divided we stand together.
It's a great quote. I was never familiar with it. And now that you bring up Jefferson, and I'm glad you did, because I wanted to segue into another area, and that is that if Thomas Jefferson or any of the people who put pen to paper to bring the Bill of Rights to fruition in the United States were alive today, they would have something to say about Americans and how they are being treated by their government that I think would shock a lot of people. And luckily, here in Canada, we have a Bill of Rights. Actually, we have a Bill of Rights, and we do have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And there's only one person left alive who was a creator of that Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that is the former Premier of Newfoundland, Brian Peckford. And he's come out and he's aligned himself politically with Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada and saying, these guys have it right when it comes to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, such as it is. I mean, it's so riddled with faults. I'll put that aside for now, but let's just say that when Brian Peckford, one of the creators, the signers of this Charter of Rights and Freedoms, comes out and says, you're doing it all wrong, Justin Trudeau, you're doing it all wrong, Erin O'Toole, why don't we listen to the man? It's like the ghost of a Benjamin Franklin coming forward and saying, you're doing it all wrong, and nobody listens. He's been canceled, basically. Again, we can't trust the people who are supposedly out there defending our rights based on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to do what the people who created that document, one of whom is still alive, says that it does. Again, a complete erosion of trust, verifiable trust. Remember Ronald Reagan, trust yet verify. Here we can verify that they're doing it wrong and nobody cares.
Yeah, and so something has snapped. we began this conversation with the word trust. Something is snapped and is broken. And the question is it repairable or irreparable? And in which way are we headed? If this is not ultimately, in the largest sense of the word, religious question, and a religious issue, then we are back to pure politics, in which politics is whoever holds power. Whether you want to take the most bastardized sense of power that Mao Zedong talked about, it comes from the barrel of a gun, or what was practiced in the French Revolution by the Jacobins, the guillotine, or in the case of the former Soviet Union under Stalin, the Gulag, and so on and so forth. It's raw power. And raw power has no place or will not accept that you, Bob, or I, Salim, or anybody have an autonomous existence apart from the state, in which our freedom is the most essential prerequisite of being a human being. That's what I was going to, because if it is not an autonomous endowment that I have in terms of my freedom, which I then bequeath to my son and daughter, that which I received, in your words, to the natural process of being born. But there is another question that is, as I said, the moral, the ethical question of me as a human being. I haven't heard, or nobody has heard, that a cow or a lion or an elephant sitting and talking among themselves and talking about, we are moral and ethical human creatures. Maybe they have a language in which they have spoken, but there's nothing to be recorded. We don't know about it. One of the most puzzling in the sense, as a scientific proposition, but not in a philosophical or religious sense. One of the most puzzling scientific proposition is how is it, if we are simply a bundle of matter, and energy and matter are in that sense, transferable. Where does conscience, which is immaterial, come from? Can matter, which is the most unconscious thing, produce consciousness, which you have, which I have?
One psychology professor of mine back in the day summed it up quite nicely, and he says the mind is the function of the brain. One cannot exist without the other. So there is a physicality to our mind and all of that. But I think we're straying into an area that we could talk about for 100 years. And maybe
no, because your professor said that, but this is a scientific problem to the extent, what is mind and what is brain. This has been going back and forth in the terms of artificial intelligence and so on and so forth, a psychological question. But the simple statement that I'm making, which again is a scientific a dilemma, that how is something as immaterial as consciousness emerge from something as unconscious as matter? So that leads to, again, it becomes a theological and religious question, and I know that you are reluctant to get into it. I'm not interested to get into it in this conversation, but I'm pointing out the strange loop. If it is through matter that it happens, then the equation or the parallel would be that when trust is broken down in terms of institutions, then the correction of that institution or of the situation can take place from the very institution in which trust is broken down.
It can happen internally, yes. I don't put out much hope that anything that's going to happen with the CBC or government is going to happen internally. I think it's lost that way.
Right. I mean, let's take about the American Constitution, the unique Constitution, the Republican Constitution. It is based upon the idea, principle in the political sense, you know. I mean, John Adams said that the American Constitution is written for a people who believe in God. And if you don't believe in God, and of course he was referring to the Christian God, if you don't believe in God, then this system will be not operable, because then it becomes a matter of trust. I mean, if you and I do not speak the same language, we cannot understand each other. So religious question in that philosophical sense is a language. And if you don't agree on an axiom, then we cannot draw a triangle,
Well, I think we
and
do
so on
agree.
and so forth.
We do
So,
agree on one thing, Salim, and that is that our rights are not given to us by a man, be him a king or a president or a chairman. That's where we agree. They're not given by a particular man.
Right. We agreed upon that because this is through language we came to that agreement, and that's the amazing statement of Jefferson: "Divided we stand." You know, and Jefferson is not going to prosecute in this philosophical position. There's no room for prosecution and coercion of someone who says, "I believe that my God is a stone," and somebody has this other belief of God, you know, which is the Christian belief, and then the Zoroastrian belief, and so on. So no, there's no room for that, because what you believe or what you accept is your privileged position as an individual based upon your freedom. And it is the commonality of respecting and accepting freedom is what makes us, again, you know, a common citizen of a state, you know, where we have then that dialogue, we trust each other, or we develop the trust and understanding. I'm coming back to the institution. The American Constitution has three, you know, it is a checks and balances. You know, there is the executive that in the Constitution itself, in a thin document, you know, there is the executive, there is the Congress, the legislature, and there is the judiciary, the Supreme Court, right? Any of the dispute will ultimately have to be worked out within the Constitution by the umpire, that is the Supreme Court. But when the Supreme Court itself closes down, or when the Supreme Court itself loses the trust, where do you go?
Exactly. Well, you know something? I've been giving this a lot of thought of late because of the situation we're in. And when I see, for example, the Kyle Rittenhouse trial and how the media handled it and the prosecutor handled it, and how when I see things like what's going on with the healthcare system and things like that, I have to conclude that we're in this, you know, the old line, we're in this together. Well, it's true in a sense that humanity as a whole is such an amorphous mass of conflicting agendas and positions and viewpoints and cultures and philosophies and politics, and it just becomes such an amorphous, moving, shifting, shapeless mass. And we are humans, and we're led by humans. And humans can be virtuous and angels, and humans can be psychopaths. And I think that what has risen to the top over the last 7-8 decades are the psychopaths. And I think that's almost in their nature. They crave power, they crave control. And we're led by psychopaths or sociopaths sometimes. Those who actually care but still do the nastiness, but they care a little bit. So here we are, humans, led by humans, controlled by humans. There's no God going to come down and save us. We have to do this ourselves. As a matter of fact, that's a tenet of the Catholic faith, is that you always have faith, you have choice. You have to get out of this yourself, right? I'm not going to intervene, says a Catholic God. I don't know about the other gods, but the Catholic God would say that. So how do we intervene? How do we not intervene, but how do we change as this amorphous mass of humanity? How do we change it? Now, I've got two suggestions. We change it from the top using the very means that some of these people have come to power, and that is by force. Or you change it from the bottom, as in Breitbart. Politics is downstream from culture, culture is downstream from philosophy. And he said the first part, I'm saying the second part. So we have to get out there as we're doing today, as long as we have this channel, to educate, to stimulate discussion, and to change a culture slowly. In the Soviet Union, when I go on Twitter, people are saying, when are people going to rise up? Oh, look, the Australians are rising up. And I have to go back and say, well, it took the Soviets 70 years for a Gorbachev to change it, for a system to change, for a culture to change. An entire lifetime, 3 generations. So, Salim, my question to you, how do we change this?
Well, my answer is very short and quick on this matter. You have moved to talk about humanity, amorphous world, and so on and so forth. Well, that's where the problem lies. I mean, with whether it is the Democrats in America, whether it is the liberals and the conservatives and the NDP in Canada, or whether it is the people, the powers to be in Europe, they're all globalists. They're talking about the world.
Yes.
But that's a different issue. We're talking about states. We're talking about jurisdiction that are bounded within the world. George Washington's farewell address was, don't get involved with the rest of the world. You have your task over here. This is the 13 colonies which we have pulled together to make the United States of America, and we have this constitution we have prepared. Within this boundary, we have a commonality that we come to understand. We're not talking about China, we are not talking about India, we're not talking about, the Middle East and so on and so forth within this space. But the moment...
I don't understand, Salim, aren't you being a little contrary
because
because we're not Americans. I'm not talking about the 13 founding states of the United States. I live in New Brunswick.
But
you live in Ontario. We all live in Canada. This is a philosophic discussion which transcends borders.
This is a philosophical discussion, and the making of the nation states. The making of a nation state was precisely to find an avenue out of what is the world. The world is a Tower of Babel, where there is no common understanding of each other. There was possibly a time, again in the terms of myths and legends, that we were all one people. And then we are no longer one people. We have multiplicity of languages. We're not talking about the physiognomy of human being. We're talking about culture and civilization in the way that we conduct ourselves. And the way, say, the Chinese conduct themselves or the Japanese conduct themselves is different from the way that we Canadians have conducted ourselves. If you want to talk about, let's talk about Canada. For 150 years, we've conducted ourselves within the context of a given history that we have inherited and which we have tried to mold into what we at least hope would be one of the freest societies in the world, from Johnny MacDonald and Wilfrid Laurier to our time, on the basis of, peace, order, and good government, the principle, but the heart of which was also a vision of the world, which was, in that sense, Christian vision, And it didn't matter where you came from and which part of the world you came from. If you became Canadian, you acculturated yourself, you assimilated yourself into that language of that culture, And nobody then said to you that as you have a culture, that you are Catholic and you are, you belong to the Anglican Church, or you are, a Pentecostal, or you are a Buddhist. No, you are a human being. And in that context, we come together in Canada on the terms of laws that we have put together and we operate. But when you start digging deeper and deeper and deeper, you see that at the core of it, there's an understanding of Canada that is foundationally Christian, as opposed to, say, the understanding of China, which when you cut through all the layers is fundamentally at the foundational level Confucian, in that sense of the word. So I'm coming back to the question. Yes, there's a global problem, so you can talk about climate change, you can talk about any other issue, and today COVID-19 is a global problem. And so what we have as a result of COVID-19, the emergence of medical tyranny. I am talking about the lack of trust or the breakdown of trust within the construct of these states that we have created, people
Okay.
have created.
Okay.
That's what we're talking about, I mean, if you go to, or I go to a jurisdiction where its foundational levels are completely different from the foundational level of Canada or the United States, we will be aliens over there. We will either have to either assimilate into that cultural value system, or we will find ourselves, in an odd place.
So what you're suggesting,
when Justin Trudeau says Canada has no more core values, the thing has snapped.
when you say that here we have people from all over the world culturally going into either Canada or the United States, because that is our history. It is a history of people from all kinds of cultures, primarily Western European, Eastern European. However, the United States has a melting pot of people from all over the world, all different cultures. But the glue that binds them together and us together, as you correctly said, is this understanding that when in Rome, do as the Romans do. If
Right.
you're a Canadian or an American, you abide by their, not necessarily their culture, but by their laws.
So
right?
we are no longer living in a Tower of Babel. In Canada, we are living in Canada. And
Right.
that's where the trust has broken down, because what are we as Canadians anymore? Or in the case of the United States, what are we as Americans anymore? Because the powers that now is controlling our lives no longer pay any respect to that foundational value.
Yeah. So let's narrow it down then, Salim. Let's take your province, and used to be mine until recently, Ontario, Canada. The premier is Doug Ford. Doug Ford is like a deer caught in the headlights whenever he's confronted with anything of any substance or any philosophic or heavy subject. And the last 2 years have demonstrated that. How do you change how his government is treating you and yours?
His government is following what is the dictates of those who no longer believe and accept the foundational values of what I took as granted until now as a Canadian, as an Ontarian. That on the question that we are faced with today, that is the vaccine mandate, COVID-19. I will not argue, or I would say that it is above my pay grade to argue about the science of mRNA or the making, the origin, the effects, and the consequences of whatever little we know now about COVID-19, the coronavirus, how it came about, and so on and so forth. And the science, in the sense, the experts saying that, they have this vaccine and that can, in a sense, ameliorate the problems, as in the past, the problems of polio or diphtheria and mumps and so on and so forth were ameliorated through the vaccine that were developed at that point in time. Okay, so fine, that is the proposition that is made, and the government, supposedly we have elected, says that we want you to take this vaccine. My point is, I hear you, sir, but I, at the end, would like to make the decision about what goes into my body. I'm not questioning, in this sense, the merits and the science of the vaccine that you have developed and you want to make me take. All I am indicating is that final decision should be mine in consultation with my doctor. And so I'm questioning the authority that you have arrogated to yourself on the basis of this health situation that has emanated recently to dictate to me how I should conduct myself and live, according to what you are setting for me, and taking away my autonomy, my freedom to
Right?
make that decision.
So what
That's
you're,
where I'm coming down to. You
so
see, debate with these people are, whether it is a question of vaccine, the question of masking, the question of social distancing. I'm ready to follow all of that, but let me make my own choice on this matter. I will make my own choice. I'm an intelligent human being. When I drive on the road, I drive on the road according to what is proper. Both trying to protect myself as I try to protect the others.
sure.
That has been taken away from me. And it is in that little one-to-one relationship that a whole cosmos of relationship has broken down. Because if I cannot be allowed to make decisions on what affects me directly, in this particular case, what goes into my body, then I lose the capacity to make decision on all the other issues, which you then take upon yourself to dictate to me how I should live.
What you just said is a communication from Salim Mansur to Doug Ford, right? You say that I would tell Doug Ford this, right?
So
Now,
that's
that
that's
actually
where
fits in. That actually
okay.
fits in, Salim, with what Jordan Peterson has just said. I think it was on a David Rubin interview where he said that he had been given information that he trusts that Doug Ford and the PC government of Ontario are directing policy based on polls and polls alone. Science be damned, it doesn't matter. It's all about the polls. So here you have the pollsters checking the pulse of the community, telling the Ford government what the community wants, and he just does it, regardless of your rights, regardless of your choice. He's following the polls. So would then a way to change all of this nonsense be to let our neighbors know about Doug Ford and how he's doing things wrong, and about individual rights, and about individualism, and about freedom, so that their opinion percolates up through the pollsters to the ears of a Doug Ford who has no mind of his own, so that he might change the rules. Is that not the way out of this nonsense?
Well, it goes back to our very first line of engagement on this conversation about the media. If it is a matter of polls, that is individuals giving their view on any set of question that the pollster is asking, and I suppose in this particular case, the pollster is asking the question about vaccination, then the individuals who are responding to the pollster, and the pollster then collects them together to make a statistic out of it, the individuals are responding based upon the information that is coming through to them as individuals from the window of the big tech.
Perfect. Yes.
And that's what as I said to you, it is a strange loop.
Yeah.
Because it is a feedback loop which is coming back. You're looking from the window, the information that the big tech, or in this case, say, Bob, you give to me, and then I process that and give it back to you. So that there is no question of any discrepancy. You've already said the question, you expect the answer, and you get the answer, and then you present the answer. This is what the people want.
Yeah.
That is, the individual autonomy of the people have been taken away, because there does not exist anymore alternative windows through which other information can be processed, received and processed.
This is like the broken window fallacy of Bastiat, isn't it? In a sense, that the window in this particular case, which is broken, is the filter through which we get all this information, which drives our opinions, which goes to the pollsters, which goes to the leaders. And that broken window, of course, is the mainstream media. And I've always said, or not always, but recently said, the media is the menace to paraphrase Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message, the media is now the menace. And so because we are now engaging in social media, this will be up on YouTube, hopefully, and Rumble, maybe BitChute, we are now part of the media. It's the social media, right? It's the people's media. And we're combating the mainstream welfare press. It's a huge David and Goliath story, but we're engaging in that. This is what this is right now. We're trying through this discussion to bring back trust through information and through a common understanding of how to deal with that information. Would you think that am I in the right direction here?
Well, only in the very long term, I would say.
Yes.
The very long term is however you want to say it. A year, several years, or decades. You mentioned in the case of the former Soviet Union, 7 decades, 70 years before the whole thing collapsed. So in the long term, yes, but in the short term, in the immediate term, it is immensely asymmetrical.
Yes.
So whatever may be the alternative media, the social media you're talking about, is in no way at the same balanced playing field with the big tech or the media that is controlled by the state or through the state or through the powers to be that finances the state, in this sense, the big oligarchs, the globalists, and consequently, the information flow that is coming to the people, to which the people then package it and process it and respond to it, is one that is tailored in such a manner that the people no longer have an autonomy. They no longer have a choice. They no longer have a way to subject that information to an examination, whether this is in any way credible or trustworthy. And that's the breakdown of trust. If you don't trust the government, if you don't trust the state, then you can't trust the information that is coming through that window, which has been packaged by the government and the state. And that's where we have arrived at.
Yeah. Unfortunately,
we have arrived at a situation where, again, I mean, this conversation is we have gone on different direction, but I just want to close it up with the following observation. Between, say, George Orwell and where we are today, the technology that has developed is, in terms of magnitude, far greater than what Orwell could have imagined. And this technology had made it easy for the state, for the government to control us as we become more and more atomized. We are living in a full-blown surveillance state. I mean, just imagine the world before iPhone and the world after iPhone. I mean, the iPhone came about somewhere around about 2005, 2006, I think, if my memory serves me. A few years after 9/11, Steve Jobs presented the first iPhone. And we can't now imagine the world, that is, our kids cannot imagine the world that existed before the iPhone came along. This little gadget has dramatically changed just about everything. In a palm of our hand, we are carrying multi-platform, in which it is the capacity, the power of computing, which is in excess of just about any computer that was available at the time when man landed on the moon. A camera, a telephone, and so on and so forth. So in that, with all the various applications that are being developed at the same time, everything that we say, think, live, move about can be monitored. That's the atomization of us. We are under constant surveillance, and the power of the state is such that they can adjust and control because as they monitor each one of us, what is our strength and what is our weakness and how to break us down.
But isn't the genie out of the bottle in the sense that now, look, what we're doing right here now is using that very same technology to thwart the efforts of an authoritarian regime. Yes, they can, at a stroke of a pen, and they are trying to do it in the Justin Trudeau government, cancel us, both literally and figuratively. So yes, there's that force. But on this side, there's what we're doing right now, using the exact same technology to change the minds of people, perhaps, or at least to have some sort of cathartic release for our own sanity's sake. So I think there's hope. I mean, if there wasn't any hope, I don't know what I'd do. I'd go off to Ecuador like a friend of mine just did.
Even in the Gulag, there was love. And
Yes.
if you read Solzhenitsyn, and yes, there has to be hope, and where there is hope, there is love, and so there is that aspect. But on the flip side, the Americans are very jealous in defending and zealous in defending their Bill of Rights, or at least a large portion of Americans are. And Second Amendment issue has been one that has been contested in our lifetime almost just about every election, the right to bear arms. Well, when the founding fathers put the Second Amendment together, the right to bear arms, that every citizen 18 and over is a member of the militia, whether consciously or unconsciously, they can become a member of the militia. That issue came up in this recent case of Kyle Rittenhouse, when he walked into Kenosha bearing arms, and from the prosecution side, he had carried the arms across the state line, and that was illegal, and so on and so forth.
It wasn't.
So without getting into the details of this matter, the point I'm driving at is the right to bear arm, when the founding fathers wrote that in, meant in a generic sense, to have a weapon on you. But 250 years later, the state that has the weapon on it in magnitude is far different than what Kyle Rittenhouse or any American citizen can bear and walk forward with under Second Amendment right, So, yeah, there is that hope, there is that freedom, there is that love. But what has happened is that the state that has grown under our watch, the whole idea was limited government. It is no longer limited when it comes to, here we are talking about vaccine mandate. It's no longer limited. The extent to which the state has grown, and it seemed that it will keep on growing. It was Ronald Reagan who said, "Beware of the following word: I am from the government, and I've come to help you," or some words to that extent. If the state then has no respect for that fundamental value that you and I have been talking about, that is the individual freedom, which is sacred, which does not come from the government, and the government therefore, or the state therefore, cannot in any way abridge it, and that would be tested, if it has to be tested, by an independent judiciary. But if the judiciary has been swallowed in whole or in part by the deep state, the big state, then that fundamental basis of a free society no longer exists. And once that happens, and I think we are very close to that, then the ideas with which we have grown or come to where we are, once it is nullified, then we are simply the property of the state, of the powers, which is what we saw in the Soviet Union, which is what we see in China, which is what has been the case in all totalitarian society. And that's a horrible, horrible fear to live with.
It is, yeah. But that's also a little bit of a hope as well, because this one branch of the state, the judiciary, has yet to be tested in some of these laws and lockdowns. It's unfortunate. They say that justice delayed is justice denied, but it takes about 10 years or more for a case to go through the court system to go to the Supreme Court, the appellate courts, the Federal Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court. About a decade. Of course, that's going to be too late for a lot of us, right? But it may be our saving grace. I don't know. I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater being a Justin Trudeau Biden government type of thing, the baby being the Supreme Court. Supposedly, some very wise people there who may be able to know probably a lot more about the First Amendment, Second Amendment, the Bill of Rights, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms than you and I do. And the jury is out, pardon the pun, on the judiciary until they decide some of these things. So let's have hope, Salim. Thank you.
Thank you.